do so. Otherwise, you won't be paying attention. So, living room session number 10 is a landmark also because it is the first time that SafeJourney, as far as I know, has invited as a guest someone who's not a psychedelic professional or a psychedelic activist or researcher or whatever. Carl's main area of focus is actually not psychedelics. So that's, I think, fantastic for us because you bring a different perspective. So Carl Erik Fischer is an addiction physician, bioethicist, writer, and person in recovery. Associate professor of clinical psychiatry at Columbia University, author of the nonfiction book The Urge, which we will talk about quite a bit this afternoon. Published in 22, and that year it was named one of the best books of the year by both the New Yorker and the Boston Globe. Congratulations.
Thank you.
His writing has also appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, Slate, Scientific American Mind, and elsewhere. He maintains a private psychiatry practice with focus on psychotherapeutic approaches incorporating mindfulness and meditation. Some of you will have your antenna going up with that one for sure. He's also the host of the Flourishing After Addiction podcast and writes at the Substack newsletter Rat Park, and I think everyone in this room probably gets that reference.
Good.
So, before we dive into the conversation itself, as I warned you, I'd like to actually start with a little excerpt from the introduction to your book, if you don't mind.
Of course.
Does this make you feel embarrassed?
No, it's
people
fine.
read your words here? Okay, everyone, just out of curiosity, no shame, who in the room has read the book? Probably not so many? Or is reading? Okay. That's great. We're going to talk about it like our audience is going to be people who've not read it. That's where we're aiming for.
Perfect.
I offer these two paragraphs because I think they give a perfect, from my perspective, a perfect introduction of your perspective. And they really set up where we're going to go with much of this conversation. Not to mention that they're beautiful, if you ask me. So,
Thank you.
This book is a history of addiction. It is the story of an ancient malady that has ruined the lives of untold millions, including not only those of its sufferers, but also the lives touching theirs. And yet, it is also the story of a messy, complicated, and deeply controversial idea, one that has eluded definition for hundreds of years. Addiction doesn't just cut across time and place. It cuts across fields far beyond medicine and science to politics, spirituality, law, economics, philosophy, and sociology, not to mention all the literature and art that point toward the ineffable gaps between. Addiction is a brain disease, a spiritual malady, the romantic mark of artistic sensibility, a badge of revolution against a sick society, and all of these things at once. This book is a history of ideas, a history of addiction as an idea, and a history of ideas about addiction. What does addiction mean to you? I'm actually going to pause there and really ask you all the question and see what comes up. Not necessarily coming down from your head, but coming up. Because this is going to help us set a frame, like a process of becoming aware of what our own implicit biases are, explicit. What does addiction mean to you? Everyone has a preconceived notion. Do only drug and alcohol problems qualify, or can you be addicted to gambling, sex, eating, work, or even love? Is it a matter of severity, like drinking or using too much? Or is it driven by how you feel, some internal sense of being out of control? Is everyone everywhere? Is everyone somewhere on the addiction spectrum? Does not being able to put down your phone count? Or is it a clearly demarcated disease neatly partitioned off from normal society? The point is not that these questions have easy answers, but that these are not purely scientific or medical questions. They are inextricable from our most closely held, culturally contingent, and often implicit beliefs and values. Questions about addiction are questions about what it means to be human. So you get a sense of where the book goes, and I think you get a sense of also where our talk is going to go today. Again, we are SafeJourney, so we're an association dedicated to sharing information about psychedelics. We're psychedelic advocates and activists, most of us in this room in one way or another. Therefore, you could say that many of us actually do practice or hold some form of psychedelic exceptionalism, right? To call ourselves psychedelic activists implies that we put psychedelics in a class separate from other psychoactive substances. This is relatively easy when we're talking about clinical and therapeutic applications of the substances. There's an easier path to walk there. However, any sort of humble study of history tends to complicate that because there were once clinical applications of cocaine and heroin and all kinds of other substances that we now would put in the more dangerous drugs category. So it's a complex knot to untangle. Here in Portugal, of course, all drugs are decriminalized for personal use, so we're starting from a different foundation than in the United States. And since April of 2023, SafeJourney, part of our mission has been talking about more than just clinical and therapeutic applications of these substances. We've been speaking more openly about celebrational and recreational uses of psychedelic substances. And our psychedelic exceptionalism is not a fundamentalist exceptionalism anymore. So those ideas about good drugs and bad drugs are blurring a little bit. But we're still psychedelic activists. So within this sphere, when psychedelic advocates talk about addiction, there are two main messages that we usually hear sort of simplified and propagated. Those are, number one, psychedelics are not addictive. And number two, psychedelic-assisted therapy is effective in the treatment of addictions to other substances. So we're going to look more closely at both of those ideas, amongst many other ideas. But now I'm going to stop talking for a little bit. And before we dive into the question and answer type conversation, I would love for you to share with the group a little bit about your personal story. That is how you got here. Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned in the introduction, Carl will speak both from professional and personal perspective on this idea of addiction and how it's evolved for you. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here and honored that you would all take time out of a rainy day for us to spend time together. It's really a pleasure to meet this wonderful organization. I've only got glimpses of it from a prior event, and I really respect your mission and the work that you do, so I'm glad to be here in this conversation. And I want to underline what Joanna said, which is that I'm not an expert in psychedelics. As in the clinical part of my work, I do refer people to psychiatric psychedelic treatment. I've referred folks to the studies at Hopkins and NYU, and I've also seen people go off and use psychedelics in an unofficial way in the United States. So it's part of my sort of awareness and treatment armamentarium, but it's not something that I do myself. So I say that all to say that I'm here to learn from you too, and I welcome your comments and questions. So as for me, like you mentioned, let's put it this way. I was training in medical school and psychiatry residency in New York City. I was really pushing hard, classic type A overachiever, insecure overachiever. And then at the transition from medical school into residency, the first intern year after medical school, and then when I get into the psychiatric residency proper, I was living a double life. And the double life was that I was really pushing hard and achieving a lot of external success, publishing a lot of papers, maintaining a very rigid external facade, working extremely hard to curry favor and respect and status from other people. But internally, my life was falling apart. I was drinking excessively. I was starting to black out more commonly. I would start showing up to the hospital, not drunk, but just tired after a hard night of drinking. And it started to peek through into my professional life. Some supervisors started to notice, and a lot happened, and I'm happy to talk more about this, but the upshot is I tried to hide what was going on with me. I was really based in shame and stigma, and tried to do it all myself, absolutely failed, and thank goodness I was on a vacation when this happened, but in alcohol, cocaine, and Adderall-fueled binge, I wound up in a manic episode, the first of my life. At the time, there's some wonder, do I have some underlying bipolar disorder or something like that? That seems not to be the case. But it was also interesting in this context. I was thinking about the car ride over. I don't normally talk about this part of it, but so I was tasered by the NYPD. I was brought to the main mental hospital in downtown New York, which is Bellevue, which is part of New York University, the classic historic mental asylum, really. And because I was in this manic state, I had all of these hyper-religious ideas. I thought that I was getting caught up in a war of good versus evil. I thought that I wasn't really in a hospital, but I was in purgatory, and that the nurses were giving me special information. And so there was this question underlying all of it where people were asking, like, did you take any psychedelics? Like, are you sure you didn't have some sort of like LSD, or did somebody slip you something? And to the best of my knowledge, I didn't. I just took so much cocaine and Adderall that I got into a fully manic state, and sleep deprivation and alcohol use and all the rest. But that was sort of like hovering over the whole experience. And the other thing about that that's worth mentioning is I may have had hypomanic episodes since and before, but that was my only fully manic episode where I was out of touch with reality. And it was absolutely brilliant. It was really incredibly enjoyable in a way that a lot of people with bipolar disorder describe it, where they say, before you crash, the flight is beautiful. That there's like you mentioned, I'd been a long time Zen practitioner. I had gone on long retreats, silent retreats. I had been trying to generate states of consciousness just through my own practice. And I'd gotten flashes of that, but there was something about being in a particular type of altered states of consciousness that felt beneficial. It felt like I was getting spiritual insights, and the ego was dissolving and all the rest. So I was telling myself a story kind of about spiritual progression and spiritual materialism, even as I was really struggling. So that was a sort of we didn't even talk about this, but I think it's an interesting connection.
I'm really glad you brought it up.
But because I was a physician, I wound up in a special monitoring program in New York, and I was mandated to go to a type of treatment for addiction. I went to a special rehab program for doctors, so I went to an inpatient rehab for 9 weeks. The standard is 28 days. There were elements of that were very beautiful and very special. There were elements that were not good. There were elements that were very old school, conservative in the sense of like tough love, really harsh coercion, all under one roof, which in some ways was a microcosm for the mental health system overall. But the upshot is I eventually came around to the notion that I, like my parents, both of whom were alcoholics, I had an addiction problem, that what I had, the issue that I had deserved to be called addiction. And I started on the road to recovery. And then I guess the last thing I'll say about that is the thing that led me to the book is, I came out of the treatment program. I felt pretty solid. I was back at work. I was being monitored. I was comfortable enough with saying, okay, I qualify for addiction. In some ways, getting too intellectual about it, asking all the conceptual questions that I studied in my research and my scholarly work as a bioethicist in the philosophy of mental illness was kind of a distraction in the early stage. But then I got to a point where I started wondering, like, what is this thing called addiction? If it's not totally gatekept by medicine, if medicine doesn't have the final say, then what are the boundaries? Where does it connect with culture and society and stigma and art and literature and all the things that you mentioned? And that's the thing that led me to the book. So, I just want to underline one thing that I think is useful for this conversation from the passage. Thank you for reading it. I love it when other people read it. I don't like to read it myself. So that was very nice. But I don't think that medicine has the final say over what we call addiction. Medicine has a disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, that's called substance use disorder. That's a tool, that's a nosology that was created within medicine. Addiction sometimes is talked about in a medical sense, but it's not the only social sphere that gets to say. And one of the big problems that has led to very toxic and very stigmatizing ideas about drugs in general is the over-medicalization of addiction. And it has led to some some dangerous ideas, I think, that relate also to my own experience. But I'll stop. I've talked for a while, so I'll stop there.
Can you tell us a little more about your practice as a psychiatrist? Do you work primarily with people who are in recovery, or is that sort of a focus, an official focus, or an accidental focus, or?
Yeah, it's an official focus. Yeah, my focus now, I do psychotherapy that's based around flourishing, because I've always been interested in what happens after you stop the acute harm. So I see people who come in extremis. I see people who come in and they're about to lose their family or their life. It could be gambling and they're about to go bankrupt. It could be sex and that their relationship is falling apart, or it could be traditional substances. But I think the richest part of psychotherapy practice in terms of the modalities I like to use, contemplative science, mindfulness-based programs. We were talking about focusing not too long ago. Some of the newer modalities that are more experiential, things that are not just about an intellectual understanding of someone's past. That's really well suited for people in recovery from addiction. So that's mostly what I focus on, but that's still a very big tent. That could be a lot of different ways.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, okay, let's start focusing on the psychedelics of it all, right?